Welcome to Web3 Watchdogs, the podcast that takes a deep dive into the world of Web3 security, compliance, and risk. Join Michael Pearl as he interviews executives from across the Web3 industry to uncover the challenges and opportunities of this rapidly evolving space. Web3 Watchdogs is sponsored by Cyvers, your one-stop shop for Web3 security and threat mitigation. Cyvers harnesses the power of AI to eliminate hacks, scams, fraud, and compliance challenges in real time, and even before they happen. For more information, visit cyvers.ai. That's CYVERS.ai.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Web3 Watchdogs podcast, the podcast that talks about everything security, fraud, compliance, risk, and basically everything that has to do with safety and security in the Web3 space. And today we have Elise Soucie Watts. Elise is an executive director at Global Digital Finance and formerly a senior associate at the FCA, among other things. Elise, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Sure thing. So perhaps before we dive in, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background?
Yeah, very happy to. So I didn't start my career in finance. I started my career in counterterrorism. So when I still lived in the US, I used to do counterterrorism research. We would take qualitative data and turn it into quantitative in order to do attack prediction and prevention methodology. It was really interesting, and I really loved that field and the work that we did there. But I decided I wanted to take a year out to go back to academia. So I came to the UK to do a master's, and that's actually how I ended up working in regulation. And that's when I moved over to the FCA, and I was doing threat intelligence, cybersecurity, and their tech resilience and cyber division, and specifically looking at things like CBEST testing, as well as the TTPs and for nation state threats to banks. While I was there, I moved over to their international division and eventually started doing crypto and digital assets international policy. I then moved over to AFME, where I was working with capital markets banks and doing, again, digital assets and data policy. And from there, I then have now been at GDF for a couple of years, and last year was promoted to be executive director. So now, in addition to doing our global policy work, I also sit on the board, look at the strategic direction, and it's been a fascinating place to see how the industry is evolving and really looking across the sector in terms of anywhere from banks all the way through to layer ones to analytics providers, and to really see how we can enhance the standards across the digital finance industry, work with regulators, and make more future-proof frameworks as financial services continues to digitize.
Fascinating, and so much to unpack here. And I would love to dive in to talk about, counterterrorism and about your time at the FCA. But before that, perhaps one more background question. Could you tell us more about GDF, what it does, what are its activities, what are you guys promoting there?
Yeah, happy to. So GDF, Global Digital Finance, we're a not-for-profit industry association. So we are a typical members association, similar to those that you have in the TradFi industry, like ISDA, ICMA, GFMA, for example, except we have a broader range of firms and a narrower policy focus. So as I said, we work with anywhere from, banks like Standard Chartered, PayPal, R3, all the way through to, Hedera, your Chainalysis, TRM, for example, as well as law firms, consultancies, startups, firms like Archax and Onera. It's very broad in terms of the remit across the digital ecosystem, but we only look at digital finance policy. So this could be stable coins, tokenized deposits, and how new technology is applied to financial services. And in the work we do, we have two key pillars. We have our policy and regulatory work, and that includes 5 working groups, which are regional, EU, UK, US, Middle East, Africa, and APAC, as well as our global task force. Through that, we respond to consultations, engage with regulators, have a number of dialogues on these topics, and again, feedback on frameworks to really advance best practice in a high standard setting across the digital finance industry. We also then have our technical forums and innovation programs, and through those, we look more at the business use case side. And so in that, We had, for example, a sandbox where we tested interoperability between the FIN P2P protocol and fixed trading. We have done number of reports on various topics, including digital custody. We had an ESG report that just came out a couple of days ago. And so again, this is really looking at how we can solve challenges across the community, but on the business side rather than on the policy side. So it's really interesting to be able to kind of wear both hats. But in my role, I very firmly look after the policy side of things. A very much policy and regulation nerd in that sense.
Yeah, obviously policy is very important, and I think that the dialogue between the industry and the regulators, something that you're promoting, is very important. And in that sense, what type of regulatory moves are you promoting? Sorry, with respect to fraud and compliance, because on one hand, being, let's say, a crypto exchange and having all those rules and regulations and having to employ a huge compliance team and a fraud prevention team is obviously not something that you would like to do, right? You would rather much focus on, go to market and sales and so on. But having said that, we all understand that it's necessary, that it's crucial. The FCA has put out its APP fraud regulation recently, and other regions in Asia have done similar things. And obviously, it's very much needed. So what are the trends that you see right now with that respect?
So, I mean, yeah, I would say actually, we have a number of the large exchanges as well as stablecoin issuers, for example, in our membership. And actually, that I think that my firm belief is that those that will scale and be successful are those that have a compliance first approach and that want to make sure that they're implementing these strategies to have high compliance standards to mitigate fraud, to make sure they're compliant with FATF's AML, KYC requirements. And I think that the trend that we see is that, as global regulatory frameworks continue to evolve, the firms which are compliant are the ones that are going to really be able to have the longevity in this industry. And I think that that's really important for a couple of reasons. First, if you look at the traditional financial services industry, they are not going to want to partner with firms that don't meet those same high compliance standards. They're subject to very high standards themselves. If they're going to be getting involved in either partnerships or long-term sort of trading strategies or integration with these firms, they're going to need to be subject to the same standards. So for example, if you think about the fact that Standard Chartered, which has set up Zodia Custody and Zodia Markets, those entities had to be signed off by Standard Chartered itself at, group CEO level. They had to meet the correct prudential requirements and they had to be subject to those high standards. And I think that, as we see, more acquisitions in the crypto space, but also scaling, a lot of crypto exchanges are now applying, for example, for banking chartered licenses in the US. Those standards are not going to be something that's like an optional or a nice to have. And actually, I mean, I firmly believe that having those requirements in place, it should be part of the growth strategy for firms. And I think for a lot of them it is. And so my personal belief is that the trend here is towards a more compliant culture. We see a lot of firms also trying to cooperate and work together so that they can meet those regulatory requirements. And I think overall that's a really good thing for the industry. And it shows the maturity of the industry and then the direction of travel that I think we will hopefully continue to go in.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that there is no other choice but to be more compliant in the crypto space. And, the days of the Wild West are gone for the crypto space. Having said that, remaining compliant is not an easy thing, right? So you've mentioned transaction monitoring, for instance. So crypto exchanges and other platforms are expected to reject, illicit funds or to detect them and freeze them and, to handle them in different ways. But the truth of the matter is it's not an easy task, right? And on top of this, there is no clear guidance. And I've spoken to tens of different compliance managers at leading exchanges. And what I hear from each and every one of them is basically it's a risk-based approach, right? And nobody really knows. And each and every one of them has, their own policy with respect to, let's say, how many hops away do you track the funds in order to actually define them as illicit or not, or how do you define funds that originated from mixers way back 20 hops away and things of that sort. So what's your take on it? Will we see any clarity? Does anyone even know how to define it? Because it's not only a regulatory challenge, it's also a technological challenge here?
So I have a couple thoughts on this actually. And first, starting with your point about a risk-based approach, I actually think that that's something that we shouldn't necessarily be looking to change because to your point about the compliance burden and how expensive it is for firms and also like various firms having different business models, having a risk-based approach allows them to have the flexibility and proportionality that's needed to align to their business models. And so I think that that's something that, it's important to preserve. And, we have seen, some guidance coming out from regulators around this in terms of how things will be implemented. MAS just closed an AML consultation today, in fact, and this was about how, it would be the sort of requirement to report like suspicion first established around like sanctions and things like that. And again, firms do want more clarity in terms of, what do they mean by first established by whom, first established by someone of what seniority. These are all important clarifications for industry. However, it is, I think, also important to have a little bit of flexibility there depending on what the business model is. But the second point I would make on this, and you raise a great point here in terms of, how far do you track it? How do you actually know? Because you have to use your own resource to do that as well, is I think that if you have a compliance first approach and culture, if you are then notified that it's suspected that illicit funds are, going through. So let's use a really practical example here because I just had this discussion last week, which is when the Bybit hack happened, a lot of these analytics providers were tracking and tracing the funds. And when it then reached certain dexes, there was a definite choice to be made because let's be very honest, the analytics providers were contacting a lot of these dexes. They were reaching out to the exchanges and they were like, we're tracking the funds. They're here. Like the whole industry was watching what was happening. Now, OKX Dex, once notified about this, shut it down almost immediately. It was like as soon as they were notified about it, they took the steps to like proactively make sure that that wasn't happening anymore. There were others, and I think one of them was called I'm not sure how to pronounce it because there was like symbols in the name. But when they were notified about it, they were like, not our problem, like didn't have to engage in this. They have now since shut down, and there was a statement, I think that was still on their website, and they were like, oh yes, like we are, going offline due to suspicion of, money laundering and terrorist financing, in quotes, which I think was a little bit amusing. But again, I think this evidences the difference between if you have a compliant culture or if you're just like, too many hops away, not my problem. And I think that to the point I was making in the beginning, that's not really a sustainable approach if you want to stick around in this industry. And I think that, there is a difference between saying, we want to protect privacy and security and being notified about, theft, fraud, illegal activities. Like this isn't about protecting privacy when it is an illegal activity involved or when it's a sanctioned actor. And I think that the industry needs to, be a bit honest with itself about that because like we shouldn't be protecting bad actors.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And, another element we've mentioned just as an example, the amount of hops away. But another element is when you actually catch the infringement in the wallet, right? So most of the incumbent blockchain analytics companies, that they will usually, flag a wallet only a few days after, postmortem, so to speak, right? So after the wallet received a certain amount of funds and after they actually managed to trace back the origin of the funds, and they will label it, let's say 2 days later, or maybe sometimes even 2 weeks later, right? So that's obviously not something that you can have as a sustainable compliance and, AML practice in such an industry, right? So we often see that wallets that we're running through our system and we label them as risky, then we run them through the other incumbent blockchain analytics companies, and we see that they're low risk because it takes them time to catch up and they don't go as far. So that's another element that we have to understand here, that you can screen a wallet right now with some blockchain analytics companies, and eventually this wallet might be a wallet that is holding illicit funds and you will not even know this, right? So that's another layer of complexity for the regulator and also for the company.
Definitely. And I mean, it's a good point. And I think that, this is something that, regulators are thinking about a lot, that firms are talking about as well. And I think there's layers here because it's all about how you prepare yourself for, yes, in the beforehand. So what are you doing to do like live transaction monitoring? What are you doing to do live risk monitoring, making sure you're aware of any vulnerabilities in like the wider ecosystem, aware of any vulnerabilities to your third party. Obviously, this was a big concern because SAFE was not just used by Bybit, it was used by many others as well. And so again, I think there's first that kind of like awareness and live monitoring that should be done by firms. But then there's also the kind of wash up and post mortem, which is, realistically, nation state actors, they're not going anywhere. Like these threats are going to be something that will continue. And so then there needs to be the discussion about what happens after. And I think to your point, how quickly can you respond? How quickly can you realize these things are happening? And then the final piece, what should be the response from the broader ecosystem? How can people cooperate to stop these things as quickly as they can? And also, what should the regulatory response be as well to make sure that the firms in the regulators ecosystem are aware of what's going on? Not every firm, depending on how large they are, is going to have an in-house like analytics team or like, have those capabilities. And so I think that, again, as the ecosystem matures, it's important that we have a bit more cooperation around these type of issues so that we can be better as an ecosystem. And there's precedent for this. This exists in TradFi. In the UK, they have bodies like CMORG, for example, that are all focused on cyber and operational resilience and making sure that, if there is a hack or if there is a threat or a vulnerability, that the CISOs are able to work together and discuss, make sure that that's patched quickly. And I think we'll get there with this ecosystem as well, but it will just take time.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk about fraud, and more specifically about pig butchering, which is obviously on everyone's lips right now. A huge problem. And again, any number between 10 billion and 100 billion would probably be somewhere in the range of the magnitude of this problem. And, it's a problem both for the crypto platforms, right? Because most of them are turning a blind eye, or at most they will just, solve this with we're educating our users and we're telling them not to do this and that, but most of them are not really employing the proper tools to figure out that their clients are being victimized right now. And it's also a problem for, let's say, crypto exchanges and PSPs in terms of receiving those funds. And we see that all the time because we build the money trails and we see how funds are being funneled from the victim to several wallets, and then eventually they land at quite prominent crypto exchanges, right? And they are either incapable or unwilling to stop those funds or to freeze them. And that's obviously, that doesn't have the aura of terrorism financing nor of illicit funds that originated from hacks. So what's your take on that? How can we tackle this problem to start solving it from both sides, right? From the victim side and from the platforms that are receiving the funds?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I mean, I personally think that, pig butchering is something that is one, like really horrible, but two, it's really sad because it obviously like preys on people that are vulnerable in some way. And, and a lot of times, these are, romance scams and things like that as well. And I think it's, really unfortunate and definitely something that a lot of action should be taken on, even though it doesn't necessarily have the same sort of maybe emotive factor as like, obviously terrorist financing, but it is really important because this impacts people so much. And so I think that, there's been some really interesting initiatives around this to try to combat it. So for example, the CFTC in the US, they were hugely focused on this last year, and I know they still are. So, they actually tried to do a lot of partnerships and work with their Office of Customer Outreach and Education. And we're looking at how they could partner with both federal and state regulators as well as consumer protection groups to try to do more education around this. And I think that, when you think about education, that's absolutely, I think, a role where the government can help more and where the public sector can be also encouraging firms to step up on this. I think it's something that's really important that we start early education on as well, like thinking about the next generation. I think there should absolutely be more education around cryptocurrency in general, but also fraud and scams in schools, for example. Like, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure that like I never received any education like around like what kind of frauds you might face. But I think it's more relevant than ever, especially as the generation of kids that's like coming through school now, they're the internet generation, like these are the Web3 kids, and they will be exposed to this now more than ever because there are so many more people out there that will have access to them and will be able to perpetrate this type of fraud against them. So I think education on all fronts, but early education is going to be really important here too. And then thinking about it on the industry side and the firm side, I think, there are some really interesting thoughts around this from a regulatory perspective. And I think that it's hard because you need to walk a fine line here between reaching the right regulatory outcomes and also still ensuring that consumers have choice. So I'll give you an example. Right now, in the FCA's current discussion paper that is live, one of the proposals is that it should be banned for retail customers to be able to purchase any cryptocurrency using credit cards, right? Full out, no, not allowed. Like you cannot basically go into debt to purchase cryptocurrency. The reason obviously this has come about is because of, gambling legislation, but also because of scams like this, because of pig butchering, and they don't want to see people fall victim to it. Now, completely understand where they're coming from with this. At the same time, though, I think that it is also my personal belief that it is not necessarily the regulators or an exchange's job to tell a retail consumer what they can or cannot invest in. Instead, I think it's the job of regulation to provide an appropriate regulatory perimeter and a safe environment in which people can invest, in which markets are protected, in which, markets are stable, and also where people have the appropriate information to disclosures, interventions to make sure, like the messages that pop up when you do a bank transfer that says like, are you being scammed? Are you sure you know this person? That sort of thing. So I think it's
just to
difficult.
clarify, how do they expect people to buy crypto if it's a legit transaction? What are they supposed to do? Through a bank?
Well,
like a
you
wire
would
transfer?
you would have to do a bank transfer to the exchange, but like you would not be able to do it with a credit card. You could do it with a debit card, or you could do a bank transfer onto your exchange and then purchase crypto that way.
Yeah, but here's the thing. How does the bank know that, this is a legit transaction, right? They are assuming that the bank will do a better job at understanding what is the destination of this transaction eventually once the crypto is bought, right? And also, what are the intentions of the person that is buying the crypto and intends to send it? What is it based on? I mean, as far as I
So
understand, banks don't have better tools for that.
no, it's a good point, which is precisely to the kind of point I was making, which is like, I don't necessarily think that just banning buying crypto with credit cards is actually going to solve the problem, because that's to the point. Your point is about consumer choice. Also, like credit worthiness is something that's determined by credit card issuers. That's not something that's necessarily, in my opinion, to be determined by the regulators. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm trying to present the problem here, which is how far do you go in protecting people from fraud? I think that we do need to take steps towards education. We do need to take steps towards disclosure and also disrupting the consumer journey, perhaps. Maybe it looks like a call. If someone's never made this kind of transaction before and suddenly they're going and doing a huge transfer, maybe it's not just a pop-up on your phone. Maybe we need to implement methods where you're getting a call from a real person and you have to talk to them about it. Maybe that could be more effective. And I think that has been proven to be effective in a lot of anti-fraud work that's been done. But I guess what I'm saying is it's hard to mandate, in my opinion, fraud prevention measures from regulators, because then you can end up with having a sort of overly draconian approach, I think, to restricting what retail consumers can or cannot do. And ultimately, I do think people should have the freedom to invest how they choose.
And what do you think about the latest regulation? Again, the APP fraud would be kind of the most interesting one, but there are others in Hong Kong, Singapore. There's even a proposal in the US by the CFPB, basically in the realms of consumer protection, in terms of if you have been, victimized or defrauded, eventually you can go to the PSP or to the bank or even eventually to the crypto exchange and demand your money back and get some reimbursement. Do you think that that's a better solution?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that you can't have reimbursement and consumer protection unless you have a totality of a regulatory framework where where you actually already brought crypto asset markets within the financial perimeter. So this is the issue that we're facing right now in a lot of jurisdictions, the US and the UK included, in that like they don't actually have comprehensive regulatory frameworks that regulate crypto markets. And so in traditional financial services, for example, you do have, you mentioned the CFPB, and in the UK, you have the Financial Ombudsman Service, where if you are defrauded or scammed or treated unfairly in the financial services system, you can go to them. And again, you can have recourse. We can't really have that if the crypto asset markets are not a part of regulated financial services. And so I think that while steps are being taken towards that, and the UK, we just had UK FinTech Week, there was a statutory instrument which will bring crypto assets within specified investments. These are all steps to bringing things within the regulatory perimeter. But I think that if you don't have a regulatory framework for crypto assets, then you definitely can't achieve those kind of consumer protection aims. So yes, I think it is good. I think having people being able to be reimbursed, in the instance of fraud is a really good thing in general. I think, but again, I do think it also comes back to education and disclosures. I think those will go a long way as well.
Got it. And let's talk about your time at the FCA. So I'm always curious about, people who are, I don't want to say cross the lines, but basically, leave the regulator or, the government in general and go to the go to the private sphere, sorry. What's your take on that? Now, looking in hindsight, when you look at the FCA, do you think that they have the sufficient tools and the sufficient knowledge to actually regulate the system? Because you mentioned earlier that you were dealing with transaction monitoring and things of that sort. How do you actually do that? Let's say if you have an exchange that is regulated under the FCA and it has millions of transactions per month in funds moving from side to side in different tokens. How do you actually, supervise that and do the transaction monitoring?
So yeah, just to clarify, I wasn't doing transaction monitoring at the FCA. The Tech Resilience and Cyber Division, they don't actually do that. What you do is you look at the resilience controls that a firm has. So you would maybe perhaps do CBEST testing, which is penetration testing into a firm's cyber and operational resilience capabilities, and look at where various might have weakness in defenses. The hackers will the ethical hackers will then go through and look for those defenses, deploy them, and then you will review how that can be improved. In terms of transaction monitoring, and when we think about exchanges, to your question, this is something that, again, back to the point I made, the FCA does not yet supervise exchanges in that way because they do not have a framework yet. And they didn't when I was there, certainly. They didn't even have a digital assets division. So that was something that was established a couple of years ago. Now, as we see the regulatory framework and the proposals being on the table, that will mean exchanges will be able to be fully regulated and supervised. Whereas right now, firms that are FCA registered, they're on the AML and CFT register, which is something different than being fully supervised. So that's coming. So to the question about transaction monitoring, I personally don't think it's the regulator's job to be monitoring every single transaction. The firm should be doing that. Then, the regulators should be making sure that there are the right governance models in place, that they are getting alerted by the firm when things go wrong, and that, any kind of large issues are being dealt with in the most expedient way possible. Because regulators are there to ensure...
kind of like the TradFi model where you have RegTech companies that are basically collecting data and sending reports. And eventually it's on the company to do that, but the regulator still has kind of a window that it can look into and figure out what is going on in the company.
Yes, exactly. So there's still going to be reporting requirements for firms, but it's definitely not going to be that the FCA is sitting there monitoring exchanges every transaction. That being said, I loved my time at the FCA. I learned a lot. I think that working in the public sector is actually a good thing for everyone, but especially people that want to understand how regulation gets developed and formed, and also, how difficult it actually is. It's really hard to progress policy fast. And I have a lot of empathy for regulators. And also, let's remember, most regulators are not necessarily going to have the depth of expertise on some of these topics that exist in industry. And I think that's why it's so important that we as industry work with them. People complain to me sometimes, they're like, well, the regulators just don't understand. Well, let's help them understand like they're not doing your job and you're not doing their job, but we can get to better outcomes together if there's a lot more honest information sharing between the two. So I firmly believe in that. I also really, hope for and would love to see someday, though, more integration of blockchain technology within the regulators themselves. So to your point about reporting, we could have much more efficient reporting if the regulators actually have blockchain technology themselves. Then you can actually, build in the appropriate smart contracts so that, your reports are more automated. So things are automatically getting flagged to your regulators. You don't have to have so many Excel spreadsheets that you're submitting through random portals. And so that is my hope for one day, to have a, much more future-proof and tech-forward regulator as well. And, there are some jurisdictions that are already thinking about that, particularly in the Middle East.
Yeah, I can guess which ones. Probably the UAE.
Yes.
So you mentioned cyber resilience, and that's actually also a very interesting topic, because we see what's happening right now, and obviously Bybit being the mega hack that just happened. But not only that. I mean, we at Cybers, we pick up the phone at least once a week to inform a company that they were hacked. Some of it goes public, some of it doesn't, but it happens too often, too frequently. My question is, basically, some of those companies, you see that they had proper infrastructures, and Bybit was Erex. They had something that on its face looked like a very robust security architecture, but nevertheless they got hacked, because obviously we're dealing with conglomerates and state actors and so on. But many players, especially the medium and smaller ones, they virtually do not employ any security measures or any proper security architecture. So with that respect, what do you think is the regulator's role? Should the regulator be involved in that? Because if you're activating an exchange, right, and you're holding billions of dollars of users' funds, should someone be looking into how you custody those funds? How do who has the access to the multi-sig wallet and so on?
Really good question. So I absolutely think that we could see more regulatory clarity on the appropriate cyber and operational resilience controls that firms should have. So we do already see some of this in some jurisdictions. So for example, in the EU, we have DORA, the Digital Operational Resilience Act, which, unbeknownst to a lot of crypto firms, will and does apply to them as well. And so I think, and like critical outsourcing, which, if you think about custody, that's going to be a critical function for a lot of firms. That's all going to fall under DORA. And so I do think, though, that yes, we do need to see more specificity around that in other jurisdictions. Though, again, reiterating what I said earlier, you want to walk a kind of careful line here, which is that firms want clarity, they want specificity. And to your point, for these large volumes, that is very important that they are meeting really high standards of best practice. At the same time, though, it's not the regulator's role to say everyone should be using this custodian or everyone should be using, this cybersecurity provider, because that should not be the job of the regulator. That's ultimately for the market to decide. You need to have, freedom of competition and also freedom of choice. And I think that people wouldn't like it if the regulators started getting too prescriptive about exactly what your tech stack should look like. We don't see that in traditional banking. You need to have, of course, certain components. You need to make sure, obviously, you have, data security, your information security, your governance around all that. But there's nothing that says this is exactly what the perfect banking tech stack looks like. And I don't think that that's right, because it will depend on a firm's business model. It will depend on where they're based. It will depend on, the suppliers that are available to them. That being said, I think that having, really clear standards is important. And for example, one thing that we did on this last year is we published a report that was all about smart contract implementation and responsible smart contract implementation. And we looked at, what were the key areas of governance that should be applied, and then underneath each of those high-level principles, how you could take existing regulatory guidance and apply it to smart contracts. So for example, for audit, for governance and security controls, for testing pre-deployment, all of those things I think are things you can have specificity around, but you don't want to say you have to have this auditor, because frankly, for crypto and digital assets, a lot of times that doesn't necessarily exist in their region yet, or it might be difficult to find. So these are all things I think we're working towards, again, as the industry matures. And I know for a fact the regulators are thinking about it as well. And so I would definitely expect to see more cyber and operational resilience guidance coming in the next few years. But You got to get the regulatory frameworks for everything else first and make sure that you're getting, down into the details.
Yeah, I agree with you. Having said that, what you usually see in the news, especially in the crypto news, is a huge focus on the securities and not the security, right?
Yeah.
And you oftentimes see, how, token issuers are being, prosecuted and so on. But, in one hack, you can lose much more funds of day-to-day customers, of retail customers, than in multiple token issuers, that their tokens basically went down the drain. So that's also something, when the regulators think of what they should focus on and what they should enforce, I think that's also something that should be under their scope.
Definitely, definitely. And I mean, I think it will. I think it's just the fact that we just don't have these comprehensive regimes yet. But as the regulation grows and scales, I think that that's absolutely going to be a part of it.
Great. So we're approaching the end of the show. Just to tell you that, in my humble opinion, all these things don't have to be under the regulators and don't have to be enforced. I think that what you guys are doing at GDF is super important, because raising awareness, right, clarifying the regulations and showing some best practices, I think it's a much better path to walk than to just issue regulation and enforce it. So I wish you tons of luck at your work. And I think that this, as I said, this dialogue between the industry and the regulators and the government is very important. So thank you so much. By the way, do you have are you active on social media? Where can we, read your publications, your reports, and so on?
Yeah, happy to. And, thanks so much. I appreciate that a lot because, GDF was actually founded about 8 years ago when there weren't any regulatory frameworks yet. And the reason we started doing this is because we really felt like there was best practice and high standards needed for industry. And our first code of conduct was actually based on the FX code and then adopted for crypto assets. And so, to your point, there is, I think, a responsibility on industry to do its best to have high standards, even in the absence of regulatory guidance. But yes, if you'd like to find out more about that, you can find a lot of our work, our policy responses, and our reports at gdf.io. And you can find me on LinkedIn at Elise Soucie Watts or on X at Elise_X_digital.
Okay, I'll add all that to the show notes. Elise, thank you so much. It was a fascinating talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Web3 Watchdogs is sponsored by Cyvers, your one-stop shop for Web3 security and threat mitigation. Cyvers harnesses the power of AI to eliminate hacks, scams, fraud, and compliance challenges in real time, and even before they happen. For more information, visit cyvers.ai. That's CYVERS.ai.